Yo, all right. So, quick review of demand and supply. We already talked about demand as being the desire, willingness, or ability to buy a good or a service. And we used, of course, the greatest car on earth, the 2001 Honda Odyssey, to perfectly encapsulate what happens when demand goes crazy. As you remember, there was lines and tiers of that product, and it shifted what the supplier was able to do. Um, Moving on, the opposite, we have supply, which we can look at through the consumer perspective, sorry, the producer perspective, which refers to the various quantities of a good or service that producers are willing to sell at all possible market prices. The supply and demand will end up making our graph, with demand being a negative slope, sometimes linear, sometimes in a parabola-like shape, or a quadratic, and then a supply that is positive. Um, They're relatively easy to understand if you guys follow my cursor because it only deals with price and quantity on the graph. And we can look at it at the individual level or at the market level. And when you hear things like aggregate demand, it's even larger. We're looking at the entire economy or the entire industry. When you hear schedules for demand or supply, it's just putting the prices and the quantities that are on the graph in a table so you can understand it through that way. Um, but I will not ask you to do that. And with demand, we're always going to have it negative because it's following the law of demand, which means that as the price increases, the quantity demanded decreases. So if we move from 4 to 2 because the price rose from, let's see, $4 to $5, people want less of it. But as it gets cheaper, more and more of that widget will be demanded. And as you see here, just another way of looking at it with using just arrows. The lower the price, the more demand. The higher the price, the lower the demand. You're thinking from a consumer perspective. You have utility here, which is just the pleasure, usefulness, or satisfaction of products and services given to the consumer. And this is semi-individualistic, and that's why we have things like demand schedules and supply schedules so we can figure out, how much one student wants compared to another. And then when we add all those together, we have the market demand schedule and the market supply schedule. With utility comes an interesting principle of diminishing marginal utility, which says that for every additional good or service provided, the satisfaction tends to go down as we consume more and more units. I like to use pizza when you're starving. You get that Domino's. The very first slice is the best thing on earth. By the 17th slice, it's just not nearly hitting the same as the first. So as you consume more and more, the satisfaction or usefulness diminishes. And then we talked about, just as a quick review, two of the major determinants of demand here, substitute and complementary goods. A substitute good is a good that can be used in the place of another. So if we see the price of Coca-Cola go up, but Pepsi's price stays the same, the demand for Pepsi will rise as people basically would assume that Pepsi is a complete substitute for Coca-Cola, regardless of taste. So if one product's price rises, its competitors, if it stays the same, will see an increase in demand. If we go to complementary goods, we see a good that goes well with another will have an effect on its other goods. So let's use peanut butter and jelly slash jam. If peanut butter's price goes up, we may see jam's demand go down because they are often paired together. Overall, our determinants are tribe, which means taste, so the changes in preference or popularity of a product or service. Um, so we can see if the entire graph is going to shift to the right, in which there's going to be more quantities demanded at all prices, or if taste change away from that good or product, the entire graph will shift left. For related goods, complements and substitutes, that may shift the curve left or right. Um, which we've already practiced in class. With income, we would see the graph to shift right if all of consumers' income, so an influx of money hits Lunenburg, we'd see the aggregate demand curve shift to the right as people would be more willing to buy all goods at all quantities at a higher price. But then in a tighter economic situation, the curve would shift left. For buyers, same thing here. The more people willing to consume and buy, just the sheer number of people would allow prices to rise. So the shift would go towards the right as there'd be higher prices at each and every quantity demanded, and left if there's less buyers. And then expectations, we could talk about, potential natural phenomena like a hurricane or presidential elections or economic downturns that would shift the curve left or right depending on the overarching expectation. And you can use the concept of tribe to remember that one. We'll hit supply real quick. We already did the Hauslickopia graph. We're going to hit elasticity in a second. That's okay. We'll just use it for supply, for demand, because it's the same for supply. So for the law of supply, we see as the increased price, we'll see an increased supply. And with a decreased price, we'll see a decreased supply. So as prices increase, producers are going to want to supply more. Um, they will make more money at each and every um, possible price, and it will be cheaper for them to produce if they shift to the right versus going towards the left with prices down, supply is down. It's getting more expensive to produce a singular unit. Um, the overarching principle here is the idea of profit, which is the money a business has left over after it covers its costs. And businesses are constantly thinking about profit. And that's what's going to make sure that supply curve shifts left or right, is because they're emphasizing the need of profit here. And yes, we do use the acronym STONER for determinants of supply. So we have subsidies and taxes, which are so government subsidies encourage production while taxes discourage production. So a subsidy for farming would incentivize farming, making things cheaper or propping up prices, which would shift supply to the right. But if there is taxation on all green vegetables, because who knows, maybe because they find out a study that um, the green vegetables are cancerous or whatever, and they want nobody to have it. They might tax it to discourage, and we'll see that supply curve go left. For technology, if there's improvements in production, we'll see the entire supply curve go towards the right because it'll be cheaper and to supply at all quantities demanded, and it would incentivize the idea to raise prices as well, whereas it will get more expensive and shift everything left, so it'll be more expensive at each and every single price supplied. Um, other goods and number of sellers is the same concept as the buyers and consumers, or the income and consumers of demand. Um, the more goods, it will make it more difficult. Um, so if there's other goods or businesses could consider, we're going to see that go to the left. But if they can solely focus on supply, it will shift to the right. For the number of sellers, if there's more firms in the market, um, there is more competition. So we might see it go left versus less sellers. We might see it be able to go to the right because they can make it cheaper. It's not always clear to in your textbook. I've had one textbook say that if there's more sellers or more competition, the supply curve will go right. Than others, I would say that would go towards the left. So you can explore that as a quick research activity in class. Expectations and resource costs, similar to technology, and the determinant expectation for demand. Other thing I really wanted to talk about today was elasticity, which I will give you guys the equation in class. So we use elasticity to measure how consumers respond to changes in the variables that affect supply and demand. So it basically allows us to understand the percentage change. So it's not a slope because elasticity can be different from point A to point B to point C to point D, especially if it's a curve and it's not linear. Um, and that's what we're trying to understand with elasticity. And so the equation we're going to use is the one that says price elasticity of demand with Q2, so quantity 2 minus quantity 1 divided by quantity 2 plus quantity 1 divided by 2 on the top, and then the same thing using simply prices on the bottom. And regardless, so for demand, it's always going to be negative, but we're not, it doesn't really matter if it's negative. We're using the absolute value. We're going to use the same exact equation for supply, except it'll be positive. So if elasticity equals 0, what you guys will see is that regardless of the price, the quantity will remain a certain amount. So there's only going to be a certain amount of demand to an extent, and nothing is perfectly inelastic and nothing is perfectly elastic. What we're going to see is things that get close to it. Um, the steeper the curve or the slope, um, so if elasticity is less than 1, so if it's inelastic, it means that a small change in price leads to a smaller percentage change in demand. Basically, that the price and the quantity changing means that the quantity won't change much if the price changes, or if the price changes, the quantity won't change much. And then the vice versa, the flatter that slope is. So if elasticity is greater than 1, it means there's a bigger change in demand if price changes. So if it's larger than 1, we're going to see um, a larger change in quantity demanded in price. Then we have perfect elasticity, in which demand is infinite at a certain price. And with elasticity, it's going to be the same exact equation for supply and the same principles. The flatter, so if it was positive and it was greater than 1, so if that slope was just veering the other direction, that entire line, um, and it's still greater than 1, we're going to see that a small change in price leads to a massive change in supply, and if it is less than 1, that a small price change does not really affect supply. And when you guys come back to school, we will practice graphing. And what you guys are going to do for me is, let's see if I can just exit out, go to what we need. When you guys come back, we're going to learn how to graph multiple supply and demand curves and equilibrium points and label them. So you're going to come in and you're going to start off by labeling a hypothetical supply and demand curve. I would prefer that they be quadratic and not linear. And then you're going to find the equilibrium point. And that's where we see the market in harmony, where consumers and producers are agreeing on the price, essentially, in an unspoken way. And then the equilibrium price at 0 will just be the points on the y-axis. And then for the quantity demanded, it would be the points on the x-axis. And then what's going to happen is if there's a shift possibly to the right, so a new demand, right? You're going to label that D1, and then we're going to find that new equilibrium point um, by keeping the same supply but a new demand, and that will happen. And then I want you guys to try and remember how we talked about ceilings and floors. For a ceiling, it's a legal maximum. And rather than thinking the ceiling is above, it actually is below the equilibrium point. And it's in theory supposed to protect consumers by keeping prices low. And we often see this with um, housing issues in like New York City. So trying to make sure certain neighborhoods don't have rents that are too high. But what often happens with price ceilings is that it can allow black markets to exist, or subletting, or reselling of products illegally. And on the opposite end, with a price floor, it's supposed to prevent a price from dropping to the natural equilibrium point, which would protect a supplier. And we often see this in the EU with agriculture, where they'll provide subsidies and try and prop up the prices of certain agricultural goods to incentivize, um, farming. Okay, I will share this with you guys. Have a wonderful day.